Welcome to the Focused Fundraiser, where we discuss how to focus on the right fundraising practices. Because doing more is not the goal, doing what matters most is in our fundraising practices. And the goal with this time is to hear from successful fundraisers who are in the trenches and who are willing to share those hard-earned practices that they use on a daily basis. Today, I am joined by Chris Maggiolo. Chris is the Deputy Executive Director at Black River Innovation Campus in Vermont. Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Rob. It's good to be here.
Yeah, let's get into it. Let's start with your background. Tell me a little bit about how you got into fundraising and what has led you to stay.
Sure. I can't say it was the most common path to get here. My background's actually in food systems. I went to Boston University and got my master's in gastronomy, and then ended up moving to Vermont in 2015 to run a distillery. I was the head distiller and operations manager of a distillery for 3 to 4 years. And then I decided I wanted to leave and do something that did a little bit more impact, social impact, close to home. We had bought a house in the area, and I had seen that the town of Springfield had recently won a federal award to open an innovation center. Connecting people had always been a passion of mine. I love networking. I love bringing people together around shared interests. So I joined the team at BRIC. I was our first full employee, and as the last 7 years have unrolled, I became our primary fundraiser as well.
So what's led you to stay for 7 years? That's a long time. For turnover is high in fundraising. What's led you to stay?
Yeah, I believe in our mission. BRIC's mission is to lift these rural communities in Vermont through STEAM education, through startup incubation, acceleration, and through collaborative initiatives. Vermont as a rural state does not always have the same access to these tools that other locations, especially urban locations, have. And so I myself am a tech fan. I'm a product of STEAM educations and liberal arts. And I want to kind of cultivate that here in Vermont for our communities, and also for my family and my kids, so that in 20 years they have a place that they can look back on and feel like they belong here.
That's good. You talked before we hit record. You talked a little bit about moving the organization from mostly grants and more into philanthropy and individual giving. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? What was that transition like for those that might be considering that, especially in the political space right now of uncertainty with federal and state grants? A lot of people are moving and trying to hedge their revenue from that. So tell me a little bit about that transition for you guys.
Yeah, and that transition in the kind of federal scene is really what was the impetus for some of our decision making. BRIC was one of the first recipients of one of the first rural recipients of an EDA I-6 grant, an innovation grant. In 2018, we received follow-on funding from the EDA Build to Scale Venture Challenge program in 2022, and we've been very lucky to be supported by several larger private foundations as well, which has made I hesitate to say our need for kind of more donor-driven fundraising, not perhaps as much in the forefront as other organizations, even though I think it should always be in the forefront. But recently we just came to realize that we couldn't rely as much on these larger programs that are in such flux. We also, I think, have enough history at this point that we felt comfortable in making some of these asks. We had collected some of our impact metrics. We had the data that shows that we're moving the needle in STEAM education programs, in entrepreneurship programming, and we had built up the network. We launched an organization just prior to COVID, which was a difficult prospect. Luckily, we had that grant funding to get us through there. And COVID was certainly a difficult time to raise for a lot of causes. With that behind us, we're now setting our sights on reaching out to folks that believe in what we're doing. And we've seen great traction, great early success in that as well, which has been very heartening to be able to go out to donors and say, hey, we've not traditionally asked, for support or for funding, but we're going to now. We're going to start small, maybe 15 to 20,000 in small raises for, let's say, a makerspace, which, in that case came in spades very quickly in a matter of, a couple weeks. And then match markers for other grants, spaces that we've shown traction and using those kind of grants in the past and that history to kind of leverage some of these asks has been pretty successful for us.
So as you made that transition, how did were you in charge of fundraising at that stage?
It was myself and our director,
Okay.
as it almost always has been.
How did you guys decide what to focus on first moving into that space? What was success? How did you approach it?
Yeah. I mean, we started off by really focusing on our STEAM education programming. It was a new program for us. We had focused more traditionally in entrepreneurship, but we saw a distinct need for workforce development and STEAM education in our region. And so we decided to start there. We knew a lot of families cared about the topics as well, and had been engaging with us in conversations around programming and infrastructure to support STEAM education and workforce development. So that kind of guided our initial effort.
Over those 7 years, what has been one thing that you feel like has stayed the same across the board on fundraising, and one thing that you feel like has shifted or has changed in fundraising?
Yeah, I think one thing that stays the same is the importance of data. I'm a data driven person. People like to see numbers. They like to see that that work is really being grounded in qualitative and quantitative data. So it's important to be able to track those metrics, track those milestones. But something that's changed, I feel, is that more and more I see funders and donors really wanting to know who your partners are and really wanting to see cross-sector partnerships, the core of programmatic and organizational efforts. We've had great success in partnering with Dartmouth College, with the University of Vermont, with Vermont State Universities and our higher ed partners, with other nonprofits, with industry partners, all of which have stakes in workforce development, STEAM education, entrepreneurship. And so to pull all these resources together not only shows that an organization is connected, but also that impact is not hyper localized to the organization, but it can kind of bleed over into these other spaces and other organizations as well.
Do you feel like that change has happened because people want to see a little bit of social proof that organizations are backing you, not just individuals?
I think that's part of it. I think part of it also comes to the back to data and metrics. In our case, as a small rural organization, if you're looking at just impact by the numbers, rural nonprofits aren't going to make the same return on investment traditionally as an urban location or as a more traditional nonprofit entity. So by partnering with some of these other organizations, you not only increase that social proof, but you also, um, you know, get the program out to more people and get those numbers that many funders are more accustomed to seeing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't heard that one before. I think that's a really good point of a shift being made in the sector of partnerships. So, like many fundraisers, I would assume that you wear a lot of hats. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
How do you stay focused and prioritize your personal time when you're wearing so many hats and can be pulled in so many directions in each week?
Yeah. I live by my calendar and schedule. So I love Gantt charts. I love just making sure that I understand where our programs, where our priorities are on a continuum, because then nothing really ever exists as a specific point. So to be able to understand what can shift when a fire comes up, or a meeting or an opportunity arises, is really important. So to be able to understand, and to have that kind of laid out in front of me visually has always been really helpful.
Okay, awesome. So, from your perspective, how are donor expectations shifting today? What do you think nonprofits should be paying attention to in order to stay relevant and effective in this space? And I think you touched on this a little bit with partnerships, but any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really been my kind of soapbox recently, with all of our partners, has been, we create a better, um, narrative, a stronger story when we work together. And that is really where I think donors are focusing right now, is in that narrative, in that storytelling, um, in the data and the milestones. Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add. Uh, it
Partnerships.
takes a village, or in Vermont's case, multiple villages.
Well, let's jump back to you had said earlier that you're a data driven person, and now you talked about story being important as well. I believe that story should come first and be backed up by data. And so you have to have both. But what's your take on how nonprofits and fundraisers, how can they best approach telling a story, especially maybe if they're early on and they don't have all of the data? How did you guys go about starting that process?
Yeah. For us, we did a lot of asset mapping at the beginning. And by that I mean, when we launched as an organization, we were not quite sure what existed in the hills of rural Vermont that would support entrepreneurship, or STEAM education, workforce development. Um, and so we went out and we talked to people. My background is in anthropology, before I got into food systems, and I love, the idea of participant observation, of getting in and working with people and just having, conversations. And those conversations are very easily stitched together into stories. It can start with a story of need. It can start or evolve into then stories of impact. Um, and I think you can build upon that to kind of really set your course as an organization. Um, I think you have to remember that, stories are, uh, subjective, and performative, and the story that you are projecting, or the narrative that you wish to be projecting about your organization or your, area of impact, isn't always the story that's being read by somebody else. Um, and so it's a fine line, and I think it's just helpful to have those dialogues, with stakeholders, supporters, naysayers, just to kind of really understand, um, the holistic view of the stories that are being told by you and about your organization.
Hmm, that's good. I want to jump over to burnout, which is something we talk about on this show quite often because it is such a prevalent topic for fundraisers. What has been a practice that you've implemented in your own life, or how have you avoided burnout over the years? And do you have any advice for other fellow fundraisers?
Yeah, it will happen. I have experienced burnout, and recovered from that. Part of that was, having a healthy, developing a healthy team culture around our organization. And everything that we do, we value, lifestyle, equally, as well as, equally on par with performance. We understand that, work is a part of life, but it does not drive necessarily, one's life. And therefore, we encourage each other as a team. We're a small team. There are four of us. We encourage each other to, uh, take time off to do the things that we enjoy doing. In my case, I love traveling. I don't get to do it as much with two young kids, but, even going to a conference in a new place energizes me. Even traveling 2 hours upstate to talk to, colleagues face to face energizes me. Um, I also enjoy board games, and so, organizing, game nights, on behalf of the organization, just to bring in community members to talk about what we're doing in a new way. Breathe some life back into my day to day. So for me, it's just making sure that you carve out those times to do the things you enjoy doing, not just as an individual, but making sure that your organization can prioritize it as well. That makes the burnout, I would say, not last as long, because it still happens. There's still days where you wake up and you're like, man, this week has been a grind, and it's tough. But knowing that the organization has your back as a nonprofit, entity that is prioritizing not just its impact but its employees' well-being, I think that's really important, because at the end of the day, I mean, all nonprofits are trying to leave the world a better place, and that should also impact that same mentality should also impact its employees.
Right. Yeah. Cultural influence from leadership is a big piece of it as well. I would assume that you've got great leaders on your team.
We do, yeah. We have a pretty flat leadership structure. I mean, with the four of us, we take significant direction and guidance from our executive director, Vin Fusca, but it's a conversation every week. We adhere to some of the kind of agile, sprint-based methodology that we'll impart to our startup founders. And that's, having our course set ahead of us, being very objective driven, but knowing that those objectives shift week to week. And so we'll have our weekly stand-ups on a Monday, and we'll kind of present what each of us are working on. And it's great. Do you need help? No. Great. Yes. Great. How can I help you? Perfect. And that's kind of how we take each week, knowing that things change and stuff comes up.
That's good. All right, Chris, one last question before we wrap up. Fundraisers often can feel stretched thin. This is where burnout often happens. But if they're feeling scrambled, they're juggling too many, or they're spinning too many plates, juggling too many balls, whatever analogy you want to use, what advice would you give a fellow fundraiser who is feeling that overwhelm right now?
It's okay to show vulnerability. I'm a recovering perfectionist. And for a long time, I thought that in order to be a successful fundraiser, you had to present yourself and your organization in its most perfect light. But I've recently come to believe that's not necessarily the case. That showing vulnerability as an individual, even to a degree as an organization, is heartening for not just colleagues and stakeholders, but for funders. They want to know that they can make a difference and help an organization that they believe in. And if that organization is showing need, a lot of times people will respond with help. And that can not just be help for the organization, but that can be just a genuine human connection that you as a fundraiser might need. It's not simply a transactional relationship.
It's good. Asking for help can be hard sometimes, but that's oftentimes the easiest path to correction. Chris, thank you so much for joining today and for sharing expertise with fellow fundraisers.
My pleasure, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. And for those listening, I hope that this conversation has encouraged you to simplify and to focus. If you are curious about how DonorDock can help you clarify and build a strong donor base, visit us at DonorDock.com. We will see you next week.